On to the book of Esther. We don't know who the author is, but it's possible that it was Mordecai, since he was so prominent in the events. The date is somewhere between 473 and 465 BC. So these events take place during that time. Our key verse is going to be Esther 4:14. A familiar one. You're probably familiar with it from a paraphrase at least. But if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. We're familiar with those last words, for such a time as this. And so we know that God raises up people. He has always raised up deliverers. We've already been through the book of Judges. So he always raises up people to deliver. But this was a situation, as we read through the book of Esther, that she was in a position that she could help. And her uncle told her simply, look, if you don't do this, God's going to raise up deliverance, but you and your family will perish. But who knows that you've not arrived to this situation for just this time. The book of Esther. The book of Esther relates to those Jews who stayed behind after Ezra and Nehemiah led the remnant back to Jerusalem. Remember, they were in Babylon. He led them, Ezra and Nehemiah led them back to Jerusalem, but some stayed in Babylon. Not everybody was excited about leaving the captivity. Some of them stayed in Persia, which is where this takes place. And the events of the book occur sometime between that first return at the edict of Zerubbabel and the second return, which was led by Ezra. The return led by Nehemiah took place a little bit later, around 445 BC. Esther became queen in Persia around 478 BC. Her story, like that of Nehemiah, takes place in Shushan. It's also known as Susa, depending on which translation you might read. But the city of Susa was also referred to as the citadel. Shushan was an ancient capital of Persia. It was an ancient capital of Persia. So that kind of gives you an idea, and that would be somewhere in the neighborhood, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in the neighborhood of modern day Iraq. Iraq is the southern one. Iran is the north. Iran's who we're with now, right? We're fighting. Okay, Iraq. That's down near Babylon. The central message of the book. Central message of the book concerns the providence of God. The providence of God. He providentially moves to preserve and to protect his chosen people as he remains faithful to his covenant. And that's the thing that you want to grasp in the book, that God is faithful to his covenant, and he is always moving providentially to bring those things about that he's promised. It was his decree that sent them into captivity, and it was his providential plan to deliver them out of captivity. Providence, in case you don't realize what providence is, the root word is provide. But providence is God directing and leading his people for the praise of his glory and to accomplish his sovereign purposes. So God is moving and directing. And the book of Esther is a reminder of the providential care that even teaches us that there's a very valuable lesson we want to learn from when we read Esther, and that is that God is sovereign over all things, and he's working at all times for our good and for his glory, even when we can't see him. Like the book of Job, which will be next. But when we can't see the way he's moving, God is always moving. You remember Romans 8:28. God works together for the good of those who love him. He works together all things. even when they don't seem to be so good. Now, there are three unique oddities about the book of Esther. First, it is one of only two books named for women. One of only two books named for women. Who was the other one? Ruth. Well, no, we're thinking, let me go back a few pages then, if you want to know. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. First and second, Judges, Ruth. I think back then we said that Moses, most historians credit Samuel, but there's really no definitive answer as to who wrote Ruth. But Esther and Ruth named after women, the only two books that do so. The second oddity is that God is never mentioned in the book. God is never mentioned in the book. There are two books, by the way. There's in the original language and in most English translations, there's no name, title, pronoun for God at all. One of two books that does that. The other book is the Song of Solomon, which does not mention God at all. But though he is not mentioned, he is there. His presence and his influence are undeniable when you read through the book of Esther. And it reminds us of that hidden providence of God. Matthew Henry, the Puritan commentary writer, wrote, if the name of God is not there, his finger is. If his name isn't there, his finger is. And so you see God all over the pages of the book of Esther. And the third oddity is Esther is never quoted in the New Testament. The book of Esther is one of four books that are not quoted in the New Testament. Song of Solomon, Obadiah, Nahum are the other three. No reference in the New Testament. And while Scripture is clear that God may withdraw himself from his people because of their disobedience, it is clear that he never absolutely and finally leaves his redeemed people. He never forsakes them. Why would that be? Because God is faithful to his covenant, and he's not going to neglect his people. You remember that there were a couple of times throughout the history of Israel, through the judges, through the kings, and even down to the time of Christ, there were a couple of times that the line was almost destroyed. But God preserved the remnant. God preserved his people because God is faithful. Now we're going to look at two things because these are the two main features of the book. There are storylines that go through it again and again, but we're going to see two main things. And the first is that Esther replaces Queen Vashti. Esther replaces Queen Vashti. This is in chapter 1. Ahasuerus was king of Persia. He's known in secular history as Xerxes. Xerxes, Xerxes, Xerxes. He is the king of Persia. Xerxes, by the way, is the Greek form of his Persian name. He reigned in Persia from 485 to 465 BC. And when Ahasuerus was called for his queen Vashti to come, you remember, I don't know if you'll remember this or not, but you've got to remember from Esther 1. King Ahasuerus throws a big party. He's got all of the politicians, he's got all the leading officials, he's got all the important people there. They're throwing a big party, and he calls, after drinking all sorts of stuff, and all the people are all in a big hoopla, he calls for Queen Vashti to come into the court. He wanted to kind of show her off because she was a beautiful woman, but she refused to come. Well, that didn't set well with King Ahasuerus, nor with the leaders who turned to him, and they paraphrase now. They said, if Queen Ahasuerus doesn't come when she's called, we're going to call our wives, and they aren't going to come either. And that was really basically the complaint. And that's the way that it was. But King Ahasuerus called her, and she refused to come. Vashti refused to come because of their drunkenness, according to verses 10 to 12 in chapter 1. Because of their drunkenness, she said it's not right, and she didn't want to be there as a display among a bunch of rabble rousers. And so, as a result, a royal edict was prepared that commanded all the women to honor their husbands as, quote, the master of their house. You know, women have got to obey the men. That was the decree. So, but Esther comes along. Now, Esther is a Persian name meaning star. Star. It's possible that her name was taken from the Babylonian love goddess Ishtar. Possible. But her Hebrew name was Hadassah. We find that in chapter 2 and verse 7. Hadassah, which means myrtle. So you've got a star and you've got myrtle, the beautiful plant, flower. She was raised by Mordecai, who was her cousin. Her cousin, after her mother and father, who his name was Abihail, her mother and father died, and so Mordecai raised her. Scripture describes her as a beautiful young woman who was blessed by God with piety, with faith, with courage. She was entered into a beauty contest because, King Ahasuerus calls Vashti. Vashti doesn't come. He gets rid of her, so they've got to have a new queen. So let's have a beauty contest. And Esther was entered into the beauty contest, and she was favored by King Ahasuerus over all the rest of the women. And so that is Esther replacing Vashti. Now, it's interesting. In this book, there are several backstories, if you will. There is the backstory of Vashti replacing, or Esther replacing Vashti. And there is the second one, Mordecai replacing Haman. And then we find at the end the Jews triumphing over their enemies who were trying to destroy them. So let's look at this part, Mordecai overcoming Haman. Mordecai was a descendant of Benjamin. A descendant of Benjamin. You'll find in there that even along his line was Kish. And if you remember, Kish was the father of King Saul. And so there is a little bit of a line and a little bit of history there. But he was a descendant of Benjamin. He was a servant to King Ahasuerus. The king knew him as Mordecai the Jew. That's all he knew him by. But what brought trouble to Mordecai was that he refused to bow before Haman. Haman, Haman. Haman. Haman was a guy who was in the court of Ahasuerus. He had a position of authority, and he just hated the fact that whenever he came out walking down the street, everybody would bow to him. Everybody would show homage to him except Mordecai. And he just absolutely hated it. But Mordecai, because of his Jewish heritage, would not bow to anyone but God alone. And so Haman gets jealous and gets angry. And he comes up with a plot that he is going to hang Mordecai on the gallows. As a matter of fact, the plot is even greater than that. He's going to destroy all the Jews. He's going to wipe out the Jews. And so Mordecai comes to Esther and he says, look, your people are under attack. And if you don't speak up, our memory verse, if you don't speak up, deliverance will come. Your family will be destroyed. So who knows that you have not been raised up to this position as queen for such a time as this? So he goes to her, and Yet, since the king had not invited her to come, you read in chapter 4 and verse 11 that no one was allowed to enter into the presence of the king, the inner court of the king, unless he invited them in. You remember that old tradition. Um, and so she said, I can't go in. But she said, according to chapter 4 and verse 16, she asked him to join her in a 3-day fast. She said, I want you to fast with me for 3 days, and then I'll go before the king, and if I perish, I perish. She said, whatever happens. In essence, I think you can read in the background a little bit there from Mordecai and Esther. If God's going to do this, he's going to do it. And if he's not, he's not. So as a result, Esther, she is able to gain entrance. She goes into King Ahasuerus. She gains freedom for her people, the Jews. Mordecai was given a high position in the kingdom, and he received the king's signet ring in chapter 8 and verse 2. Now let's look a little bit at Haman. Find out a little bit more about this guy. Haman was an Agagite from Amalek. That's 1 Samuel 15. Haman was a man with great pride. He was a man with great pride. He hated the Jews because of Mordecai's insubordination. He appealed in chapter 3 and verse 8. He appealed to King Ahasuerus to kill all the Jews. And he somehow tricked Ahasuerus into writing such a decree. And Haman, in his hatred for Mordecai, builds a gallows that he says he's going to hang Mordecai on. But in chapter 6, in chapter 6, King Ahasuerus, one night he's having a hard time sleeping. And so he calls for the books of history to come and be read to him. And as the books are being read, they come across a record that sometime before, Mordecai had saved the king from an insurrection. There was a group that was going to rise up against King Ahasuerus, and Mordecai stopped that. And Ahasuerus learned that, and he decided he's going to give honor to the man who saved him. Now, this is interesting. He calls Haman in. Well, actually, when he wakes up, he says, who's in the outer court? And they said, Haman's here. He said, okay, have him come in. And he said, Haman, you're knowledgeable. You're really high up. You think of this. He said, what should be done for the man that the king wants to honor? And Haman's pride, he says, well, who would the king want to honor more than me? And so he says, okay, if that's the way it's going to be, then you need to put the signet ring on the guy. You need to put him on the king's horse. You need to parade him through the people and let a messenger go before him and says, this is what happens to the man whom the king desires to honor. And Ahasuerus says, sounds good. You go do that for Haman. For Mordecai. Excuse me, you're right. You go do that for Mordecai. Wow. I mean, that really takes the wind out of Haman's sails. He does it. He leaves Mordecai through town. Then he goes home with his tail between his legs and tells everything to his wife, Zeresh. And she says, well, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. Kind of prophetic on her part. She said, it's not going to turn out well for you. And that's the way it was. Haman's pride caused him to think that the king would honor him, but it was for Mordecai. Now, chapter 7 is a key passage as the plot of Haman is revealed to Ahasuerus. Esther decides she's going to throw a feast. She invites Ahasuerus and Haman. And Haman, he's all built up again, said, go into this feast and everything's going to be fine. And then she reveals that Haman is trying to kill her and all her people. And Ahasuerus steps in, and Haman was hanged on the very gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. There are a lot of twists and turns in this story. how Esther replaces Queen Vashti, Mordecai replaces Haman. So the book of Esther closes with the establishment of the Feast of Purim, Purim. If you have any Jewish friends or you've seen Jewish um, religious things advertised on television, Purim is the feast that they still celebrate. It celebrates the deliverance of the Jews. It celebrates when they were delivered from extinction, if you will. It was a great day of thanksgiving, for even though they had forsaken God, he was faithful to them. He spared them. The name Purim comes from the fact that Haman had cast lots. He had cast lots, which is also called the pure, the P-U-R, the casting of the pure. And so this is why they celebrate the Feast of Purim. Now, let me recap, because the book focuses on those three feasts. You had one feast at the beginning with King Ahasuerus. You had another feast hosted by Esther. And then you had the final one as the Jewish people celebrate God's deliverance. And each of those feasts feature that reversal of fortunes. The first one, Esther replaces Queen Vashti. In the second one, Mordecai replaces Haman for honors. And in the third, the Jewish people prosper instead of their enemies. It is a fascinating read. Go through the book of Esther once more. And I encourage you to take time to do that. A few things to remember. Ahasuerus reigned over a kingdom that stretched from India to Ethiopia. Large kingdom that he had. She had a caretaker before the beauty pageant. His name was Hegai. And in the evening, she was under the care of Shaashgaz. I love Old Testament names. Shaashgaz. Haman was overjoyed at being invited to Esther's feast. Mordecai was placed over the house of Haman to do with what he wanted. Haman's 10 sons, along with 500 other men, were killed by the Jews. This was part of the Feast of Purim. They had those days that the king said, you can go out and do to your enemies whatever you desire. So 500 men and Haman's 10 sons were killed. There were 127 provinces in King Ahasuerus' reign. 127 provinces. So he had a lot of territory, a lot of people. Take time to read Esther. I think you'll enjoy it. Just to see, again, you don't see God by name, but you see him all over the pages, providentially moving to protect his people and to remain faithful to his covenant.